The fear of being alone is one of the most primal human emotions. And it makes sense. After all, we have evolved to depend upon others for our very survival, not alone our mental health and well being. Now, before I get into this, I just want to note that when I'm talking about being alone within this context, I'm talking about being single, being without a primary partner. Not that you are completely isolated and that you don't have any social group. That's a completely different situation. So, again, this is for those of you that are feeling that pain, that fear of being without a primary partner in your life. Now, this information that I'm going to give you can actually be used sort of in three different ways, depending upon where you are. So, first, for those of you that maybe you're in a marriage that you're thinking about ending, and you are recognizing that the only reason that you're staying in this marriage is because you have a fear of being alone. This might help you figure out what your next steps are. This can also be useful for those of you that are on the other side of divorce and you're single and you're worried that you're going to be alone forever. And you're really feeling that fear and that anxiety about what comes next and am I going to be okay? And finally, this can also be used by those of you that are on the other side of divorce and yet are a little bit further along. So maybe you are thinking about dating, or you've even started dating, or maybe you've even entered into a few relationships. And you're worried, or you've recognized that maybe you're not picking the right people. And maybe you're staying in relationships when you shouldn't be. And you're starting to recognize that all of that might be motivated more from a desire to not be alone than by recognizing that, hey, this person really is a good fit for me. So, with all of that out of the way, here are 5 things that are worse than being alone. The first of those is probably the most clear cut, the one that we all can recognize. And that is being in a relationship with somebody who is abusive. And this can be any form of abuse. You know, we recognize that physical abuse so easily because that's the one that's so obvious to us. And it's pretty clear that you're going to be better alone than you are with somebody that is physically harming you or even your children. But it's not just physical abuse, is it? It's also that emotional abuse. Maybe it's financial abuse. Regardless of what it is, this is a person who is controlling you, who is manipulating you. And part of the hard part with an abusive relationship that those on the outside don't often recognize is that it's not all bad. And so there's those good moments, sometimes those wonderful moments or those wonderful characteristics in that person. And that's what keeps us there. And so when you're in it, sometimes as you're sort of weighing that good and that bad, aspect of it, sometimes it's a little bit hard to figure out what's better and what's not. But the reality is that if you are being abused, you are not being loved. You are not free. And it's so interesting, isn't it, that sometimes we stay in that abusive relationship because of that fear of being alone, yet being in that abusive relationship has its own set of fears. That fear of when is it going to happen again? That fear of, am I losing myself as they continue to control me? And unfortunately, for those of us that have been abused, again, it doesn't have to be physical. We're talking emotional and financial as well. If you have been abused, you doubt yourself even more. And so you might worry even more that you're not able to stand on your own 2 feet, that you need this person in order to be okay. But that's their voice that is in your head. Because you see, they needed to tell you those things so that you would stay with them. But that's not the truth. You are strong enough to not just survive, but to thrive without that person in your life. And I know for me, I would rather be alone than be in a relationship with somebody who is claiming to love me one moment while harming me the next. Now, many relationships don't fall into the abusive category, but they're still not what I would call a good marriage. And and many times it can be better to be alone than to be in a relationship that is characterized by a constant tension, where you always have that walking on eggshells feeling, where you come home and you don't know who you're coming home to on that particular day. And sometimes these can be a little bit more difficult to recognize. After all marriages have their ups and downs. That is completely normal. But there's a difference between a relationship that's doing this sort of thing and one that has these extremes of highs and lows where you are constantly feeling anxiety and tension. And it's not healthy for any of us to live that way. And so many people that I speak to who've been in marriages like that speak about the relief that they feel when they are on the other side and they don't have those extremes anymore. And all of a sudden, they have so much more space in their life, in their hearts, for all of the things that bring them meaning, bring them purpose. It's absolutely crazy making living on that roller coaster. And you may find that it's actually a relief to walk alone on more level ground. Now, my third point actually relates to the first two, but takes a little bit step further. And that is, it is better to be alone than it is to be in a dynamic that is harmful to your children. Now it goes without saying that if it's an abusive marriage, even if your partner never directly harms the kids, that relationship, that dynamic, that environment is hurting the children. It is not healthy for them to see that happening to their parent. And even if you think that they don't know, they probably do. They often see so much more than we even realize. It's also not good for them to be around constant tension and constant fighting. Kids internalize all of those things that they see. And so they're learning about themselves and who they are as they're watching you and the dynamic that you have in your marriage. And even more so, you're teaching them how to be in a relationship. You're teaching them what you should tolerate in a relationship. And so even if whatever's going on is something that you would put up with on your own, think very hard if that's something that's worth it for your kids. And then sometimes it might be that your partnership with your spouse is basically okay. But the way that they are to your children is far from okay. And the interventions that you've tried have gone nowhere. And at some point, you have to make a choice. Do you want to keep your kids in that environment, or are you going to make a change for your children? And I know that what you want so much for your kids is for them to have a healthy two-parent home. And to take that other parent away from them, to take that intact family away from them, feels like you are tearing them apart. And this can be one of those where there's no good choice. But you have to look at the two choices that you have and think about, of those, which is the one that is going to do the least amount of damage to the kids? Which of these is going to give them the most opportunity? Which of them is going to teach them the values and beliefs that you want to pass on? And sometimes that may mean that you have to make the decision to be alone. And a message for all you parents out there. I know that there's often so much guilt that goes along with divorce and the impact on kids. And I've taught middle school for 20 years. And so I have a very large data set of students to pull from to give you some information on what I've seen over the years. And one of the things that I have seen time and time again is that when they are in a home where there is lots of tension, where there is abuse, where there is just this uncertainty and where they don't feel secure, where they are stressed. And that stress can come out in so many different ways. They can show it in anxiety, they can show it in failing at school, they can show it in acting out, but they're not thriving. And for the ones where the parents end up divorcing, as long as it's not an ugly divorce where the kids are used as pawns, that's a whole nother situation. But the kids grieve. They definitely go through a transition period. But after that transition period, they often are doing so much better than they were prior to that divorce if the marriage was an unhappy one that the kids were aware of. I know that this is not what you wanted for your children, but you have not destroyed them by choosing to be single. You have not destroyed them by doing what you need to do to stand up for yourself or to stand up for them. It can be better to be alone than to feel alone in a relationship. After all, when you are alone, you know where you stand. You don't have those expectations. But when you're in a relationship, you have certain expectations that your partner is going to see you, is going to interact with you, is going to treat you as part of a team. And when time and time again, day after day, you feel invisible, unseen, unheard, that is excruciating because you have your hopes up, you have that expectation, and it's dashed every single time. And at some point, you may have to ask yourself, if we're in this marriage, but we don't have any communication, we don't have any connection, yet we still live within the same four walls, is this even a marriage? And being truly alone can definitely be scary. But being alone while you're in a relationship, well, that's devastating. And then finally, it is better to be alone than to have to be someone that you are not in order to be in the relationship. And sometimes this happens from the very beginning. We put on this mask, we become the person that we think they want us to be because we are so afraid of being alone or of being rejected that we pretend so that we are taken in. Sometimes that happens over time as values shift and all of a sudden you recognize that you're in this partnership with somebody, but that your goals and your core beliefs aren't the same anymore. And so maybe you just keep your mouth shut, or again, maybe you pretend that you do agree with them only to keep the peace. And that rejection of self, that denial of who we are at our core, is probably the very worst thing that we can ever do to ourselves. And so it is better to be you alone than it is to be someone else in a relationship. So yes, being alone can be scary. It can be hard. It can be lonely. It can be isolating. If you're a single parent, it can be exhausting. But being alone isn't the worst thing. And like so many other things that we fear, I bet you'll find that once you're there, once you accept it, you'll actually grow into it and learn that, you know what, maybe it's not so bad after all.